Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. It's an unusual music show where we dive into, well, pretty much anything and just do very oddly formatted reviews, right? I kind of like to describe it as the fringes of music itself sometimes. Anyway, today we're looking at a rather unusual release actually. This one essentially starts off a wonderful series of releases by the record label Temporary Residence, known perhaps for helming releases from the likes of Explosions in the Sky, Illuvium, Mono, and many others. So this is an album that I've been trying to hear for years and years since ever first coming across it. However, there is no digital footprint of this album anywhere except for its existence. No way to hear it. However, I was finally able to source a copy. And now that I'm at a point in my life where I like to review things I'm listening to for this very show, I thought it'd be very interesting to actually review my very first experience of this album. So, yeah, an unusual release, but one I am so glad to have heard and one I'm very excited to actually present to you all watching today. So, without further ado, I present Travels in Constants Vol.1 by Water. So this release, I would describe this for me as a bit of a white whale in some respects, right? It's the kind of album I'd come across when first looking into some of the releases featured in the Travels in Constants series. So the series compiles a bunch of albums recorded for this sort of subset of releases by Temporary Residence. A bunch of my favourite bands of all times, like Low, Illuvium, Songs Ohia, a bunch of very cool bands making these very unusual and strange releases. And the debut in the series, Travels in Constant Volume 1 here, this is a complete mystery in many respects, as there is absolutely no information as to who these people are, who is on this, how many people there even are. Absolutely nothing to find out. It's kind of like, to me, like an album with no source of credits, if that makes sense. And I always remember when first coming across that, being very curious as to know what something like that would sound like. And as there was no digital version out there, it maybe might have cropped up on some dodgy websites by now, but I am not going to get involved in that. I instead leapt the chance to purchase a second-hand copy right here, so I could finally listen to it for the first time. So what I did when I sat down to first listen to it was got out the phone and started writing my very first thoughts of hearing this, which is what proceeds from now. So let's figure out what's going on here, shall we? So, Travels in Constants by Water, opening with a gentle resonating tap and a shuffling of some objects and a kind of faint hiss of lowercase. It establishes this very empty scene of a very empty room, that echoes and bounces off the very walls themselves, before so faintly in the background is the rise of some very subtle drone. The pull of some stringed instrument, it feels, that's just precariously placed within those echoes from those objects, all the while capturing this very faint little rhythm from the darkness. It's an incredibly somber, melancholy and lengthy opener, really delving into the forms of abstraction and the persistence of a, rather persistent beat thumping and tapping away, before faint activity in the background lets that acoustic guitar, attempt to come in. And it seems like that guitar tries to pull the soundscape into the realms of composition, perhaps, which it seems to achieve as then a multitude of other instruments start to rise, like ready to begin this procession following this very dark and chilling opener. To me, it feels like a very, very steady and slow build-up, one utilising the incredible amount of space and time to establish a very dark and dingy setting, one that's oddly enough rather murky, a lack of details against the surrounding darkness, which is very peculiar, but I find it very oddly inviting and hypnotic. It's kind of got this sort of pendulum effect as the tap starts to take on much more recognisable shapes perhaps. And it becomes much more characteristic when the guitar becomes much more centre stage, acting as a sort of anchor between these unusual little phrases, fading into the silence to let the drones of strings fall heavily on a descended note, all the while the drums, which have slowly been building up and up and up, just starts to fall into pure abstraction itself, a sort of flurry of precarious hits that strike so suddenly at times, so almost tensely, as the atmosphere is elevated by the presence of, this heavier drone perhaps. And although, you've got this incredibly jazzy drummer, just suddenly pushing it all so oddly, it becomes a fascinating soundscape, the guitar twanging away on this unusual low end, with a sharp atonality to it as it begins almost, it's supposed to get this accompaniment of notes suddenly dragging it into just chaotic discordance. The drums creating this sense of waves continually crashing down all around us, crashing against the rocks with these big swells of water, rising up with the very volume itself. It's a very peculiar section of the song, but I find myself so oddly captivated and intrigued and kind of in awe at the very strangeness that it all offers. From the pure silence itself, this very unusual soundscape has grown and grown to this strange lo-fi acoustic post-rock jazz of sorts, one that is carried along by the drums so brilliantly and precisely, playing these constantly, evolving time signatures that guide the rest of the band into these strange instances of their own instruments. Unusual chord pulls, a flutter of plucked notes from the stringed instrument, a slight bends that the notes are awkwardly placed against. So, to begin with, atonally bizarre but fascinating in its untethered freeform expression, constantly keeping you precariously balanced against these slower descents, and the ebbs and fades into the water, following the more gentle flows that seem to be coming out of it now, before the drums just agitate the whole sea once again. And it's like you're getting pulled between two very distinct sound instances, one of minimalism and quiet, before finding new ground in these jazzy deconstructions that all combine it in an unusual way. Fascinating listening experience, but it then evolves into something truly, truly beautiful around 8 minutes in or so, when you just get a very beautiful descend on the guitar, followed by a gorgeous swell of that stringed instrument, which might be a contrabass or a cello perhaps, not too sure, but it creates this wonderfully gorgeous note that rises up and up as while the drums continue to explore the spaces of sound with these very unusual fills, like a fight against the structure that's now been established as it perhaps opts for more unusual time signatures once more. But it feels like the whole thing is now opened up into the most beautiful little riff of just gentle post-rock minimalism, a melancholy little musing that fills the space for some moments before the strings opt for these very unusual pulls here, like finding moments of tension before finding ground in the beauty of its notes once more, holding so nicely on these tones that rise so up against the guitar, continuing that riff, that little melancholy muse that's so oddly unusual, yet so pretty as well. I find myself actually very much in awe of what I'm hearing here, or was hearing when I first listened to this. This album has just been a beautiful surprise, I find. It's one that feels born from such an unusual level of experimentation, leaning on, the sort of experimental sides of the likes of post-rock and jazz to create something very unique here. A wonderful interplay between what I'm pretty sure now is just 3 instruments, the drums, the guitar and the string instruments, all filling up that space. And it seems to be what makes up the bulk of this recording. Just 3 instruments following this muse to just create some music just to fill the time with, essentially. And what a lovely thing this is. Like all the instruments have just come together for these beautiful somber moments, for breaking away from that structure, but then, especially at the beginning, but then finding time, to just build up into this lovely, joyous instrumental section for the entire outro, one that is carried so nicely by the sheer vibe these musicians have created in this space. And as odd as it is, the relationship that the instruments all establish against each other in this unusual sound exploration is one that just sounds so joyous to experience, Even when it delves into those unusual little sections, there's just, for me, that sense of community that I adore in music like this, of individuals coming together just to record something, just to cement a performance in time itself, one that is untethered by the constraints of genre, and it just slowly evolves nicely and calmly, And finding Brew right at the end for a little bit more of a musical number, actually, a final lifting of the mood and energy as the strings just solo over the top of that all. Man, what a beautiful way to end the whole thing, like a lovely melancholic guitar line against this lovely rigid beat that has time for these odd fills once more. And I just think it's so charming. Like, it starts off so darkly perhaps, but then it just evolves into this beautiful composition that just celebrates music itself, I feel. So, I have to say, this is the kind of thing I adore about discovering music, through a bit of digging and a bit of unearthing. We have these wonderful musical experiences that we can find if we just put in the time to discover them. And sometimes taking time to discover music like this, and whatever that may be at any given time, it can result in finding something that you feel is so rewarding. Something that clicks and resonates in such a delightful way. And for me, it's something that just carries the emotions in a way that is, it's oddly unexpected, but very truly welcomed. And I have enjoyed the time spent, on this, somewhat long composition they've written. An experimental little dirge that really explores sound design so oddly at times, as well as just freeform composition as well. Like, the development of all of these instrumentals, like all coming together, it really captures the theme of this album, or what I think is the theme, which is running water itself, But I'm so pleased to have just finally found out what this sounds like, as for me, it's just something very interesting and pleasant, just sitting buried here amongst this physical release here. And prior to writing these words, I actually had no idea what it sounded like, as mentioned. Trying to find this out before, the internet had nothing, just references to its existence and nothing more. Here we are, finally hearing it, and oddly enough celebrating that sense of community that the music was presenting. And having heard it, it feels like the hearing of something so special, a strange instrumental performance straddling very unusual lines of genre, all resulting in this wonderfully beautiful experience. So this is definitely an unusual review, no doubt. We have discussed albums before where we know little to nothing about the respective artists involved, but the existence of this band is one that's truly shrouded in mystery. The physical release here tells us nothing, essentially. Just the name of the release etched onto the CD itself, and the track listing on the reverse. No credits, no attribution, nothing. This album exists only for what it is, and nothing more. And I think there's something cool about that. With this being the first release in the Travels of Constants series, there's already a bit of air of mystery regarding it, the beginning of this wonderful series of releases traversing so many genres and bands and artists, and its very genesis is this one right here that we're looking at. A musical performance performed by, well, who knows? Performed by strangers. And I think it's peculiar to me, as it is a truly wonderful release that just straddles the line of experimental music so nicely, and starts off this string of releases with an odd, unsolvable mystery. Like said, the series strings together so many artists, a bunch of rather well-known ones, we could argue, and yet here we are at the beginning, and with absolutely, no way of ever finding out who it is that started this. A secret, to better shroud the release in mystery, and let it act as an expression of just music and nothing more. And the identity not lying with the band, but lying with the composition itself. Something a little bit strange. That twists my brain a little bit. You know, but I just think the whole thing is so strange and fascinating, and I've always wanted to check this out and just find out what the deal was. And what a pleasant surprise to find something that is equally avant-garde and accessible. I'm so glad to have heard it. And so, before we close off, what of the only information we have then? The name of the song and the name of the band. We might not know who they are, but they call themselves either By Water or just Water. No one seems all that sure on this. But regardless, Water, and a track title of Staring Running Water or Starring Running Water. Maybe accreditation of sorts here. That the album is not being credited to people, but actually being credited to water itself, a credit to the flow and movement of water. And it's something that makes a little bit of sense in my head when we consider the anonymity of its members and its only credit of being by water. Maybe a play on words there. Maybe I'm just reading into it too much, but it's just an inference I get, and I thought it was interesting to try and mention. Because it feels like, maybe, especially with how the music sounds, that this is a work truly influenced by the very substance, the lifeline of existence, and a tribute to that, perhaps. And I think it's lovely, this music that sounds just this way, existing as something very representative of something different to what it literally is, which is just a small CD in a cardboard slipcase. Abstract of it. Its meaning is what you make of it. But I think that's cool. And so with that, I think we'll be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. I'm actually not sure what else to say on this one, It's once again a review of curiosity, My weird, drive to want to know what certain things sounds like. Sometimes it's baffling, like the dive into David Gross's album. But sometimes it's truly wonderful, like what we have here. And this album, for all its peculiar parts, is something that truly delighted me. Something that feels like the capturing of like-minded individuals, whoever they may be, all coming together to perform music. Truly brilliant in my mind. So with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best. Take care.